Hi everyone, I'm Emilie Pine and I'm a drama professor at UCD and I will be your chair for this evening. So I'm really happy to welcome you to the Royal Irish Academy. If we were gathering in real life, you would by now have walked through the front door of the Academy, across the flagstone hall and into a beautiful 18th century room where we would be joining together to discuss tonight's subject. We're doing it virtually instead, so it's a shame that we can't be in the Academy building itself, but at least this means that more people get to join. And there is something I think about being in a virtual space that is very fitting for our subject this evening, which is of course Dion Boucicault. So you are welcome, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're going to do this evening and also why this event is part of a larger kind of context. So tonight is part of Boucicault 2020, which obviously has been postponed until now, which is a series of events on Boucicault's life and legacy. If this evening whets your appetite, there is still a chance to sign up for tomorrow's programme, which includes an inquiry into stage Irishness, a workshop on celebrity and souvenirs, and a panel of theatre producers assessing Boucicault's legacy in their own work. Further events are going to happen in June and September and continue these discussions. So please join us. If you want to register for tomorrow, slightly later on in this webinar, the links to do so will be in the chat. Tonight, of course, we are here for a wonderful event, a lecture by Dr Aoife Monks on the decline and fall of the press, Dion Boucicault, virtuoso, journalist and plagiarist. Dr. Monk's lecture will be followed by a short response from Sara Keating, and then we'll have a chance for questions and discussion from everybody. And again, that will be monitored through the chat. So get your questions ready as you're listening to Dr. Aoife Monks. So to our main speaker, I'm going to introduce her and then hand over to her. Dr. Aoife Monks is Reader in Theatre and Performance Studies at Queen Mary, University of London, where she is Director of Arts and Culture. She has published 2 books on costume and recently collaborated with the National Theatre's costume department to produce an exhibition and photography book on their work. Her current project considers the recent histories of virtuosity during the Celtic Tiger, and her title this evening is The Decline and Fall of the Press, Dion Boucicault, Virtuoso, Journalist, Plagiarist. Aoife.
Thank you very much, Emilie. I was just saying how much it's like being a deus ex machina turning up suddenly on screen. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'll get stuck in and I'm just going to do the dodgy thing of sharing my screen. Let's hope it works. Machines don't always like me as much as Boucicault liked them. It does work, look at that. So what I will say to start with, which is again appropriate perhaps for the topic of this paper, is that it's true, we didn't manage to hold this event when we should have done to celebrate the bicentenary of Boucicault's birth in 1820. In 2020, because a certain pandemic happened instead. However, Boucicault frequently lied about his age and took 2 years off it and claimed to have been born in 1822. So the fact that we're doing this in 2022 has a certain sort of appropriateness, given that Boucicault was frequently accused of lying and deceit throughout his career. And as I say, that's a topic that I'd like to talk to you about this evening. Before I get stuck into Boucicault, I just want to ask a few questions. And these are questions that are perhaps worth pondering yourself, pondering perhaps your own instinctive answers to them, and whether in fact those instincts are right or not. The first question is whether an actor is an authentic artist, and whether acting should be considered an art or a craft. It's often described as a craft, and one question I would have is that if we do call it a craft, what are we saying about the status of acting as a form of artistic work? For example, is an actor capable of producing original work? And finally, what is the role of the journalist in determining the status of the performer or as artist or not? These are questions that plagued Boucicault's career, and I want us to think them through as we go through the course of the paper. Now, let me see. Is that going to work? It is going to work. There we are. So let me go down one. So what I would say is there are a range of possible answers to these questions, but we can actually find some answers in tax policy and the law. So if we look at the Irish revenue, for example, you'll see that they give tax relief to artists, but they have a very clear sense that performers don't count as artists. So writers, playwrights, composers, painters, sculptors qualify for tax relief, but actors, dancers, and singers and musicians don't. So here we have an answer, and we can see a similar answer appear in the law, in which performers have far less legal protection than those kinds of authorial roles. They do somewhat in the recorded media, but certainly not in live theatre. So again, we have a certain kind of answer that emerges in the law. However, I want to think these questions through the career of Dion Boucicault. And while I'm sure those of you gathered together to hear a paper on him have probably heard of him before, it's no problem, I don't think, to sort of dwell in the history of his career a little bit, to remind ourselves of who he was. So Boucicault, as I say, was born in either 1820 or 1822 and died in 1890. He was born in Dublin, but made his career around the world, particularly London, New York, and Dublin, and was famed as a playwright, actor, and impresario, writing 153 plays and being a renowned virtuosic performer, particularly of stage Irish roles on stage. Now, while he tends to be remembered in Ireland as a playwright, I want to focus, in fact, on his fame as an actor, and also recognize the ways in which he radically changed and developed theatre production practices, including doing things like inventing fireproof scenery, the Corsican trap, and lobbying for copyright and plagiarism protections, and also coining the term sensation scene or sensation drama, writing melodramas that included incredibly exciting scenes like steamships blowing up in Louisiana, people swimming away chased by crocodiles, tenement buildings burning down, and fire trucks turning up to put the fire out. So we have a sense of a figure who is a kind of composite figure in the theatre, who offers us a sense of a whole range of theatrical functions. And it's that composite figure that I'm really interested in exploring this evening. Now, Boucicault is often accused of deceitfulness, being unreliable with the truth, plagiarism, and contradiction. And there's a certain way in which the sense of his contradictory attitudes and approaches contribute to a sense of him as a sort of lovable rogue. So let me introduce you to some of these contradictions. Perhaps the most famous is, as I mentioned, Boucicault lobbied for plagiarism and copyright protections for writers, both in the States and in the UK. He gave evidence to various government hearings. He worked with other writers to take a case to the Supreme Court. He was also one of the first people to be sued under the new laws that he helped to bring in for plagiarism in his play After Dark in 1868, in which he infamously stole the railway rescue scene from Augustin Daly. And this is a really important part of American case law, in that the judge argued that it wasn't only the words of a play that could be stolen, but the very ideas or concepts within them. So concepts of intellectual property really play out through this court case. So Boucicault lobbies for plagiarism. He's one of the first writers to get a royalty for his work as a playwright, and at the same time, he then gets sued for plagiarism under the laws he helped to bring in. He also accuses journalists on an ongoing basis throughout his career of cheapening the theatre, particularly because of the pressures of advertising in the newspaper industry. So he argues that their commercial pressures degrade the theatre industry. But what, of course, again, is contradictory is that he tends to make this case through journalism. So he writes numerous articles for newspapers and periodicals. He also had a failed career as a journalist at the start of his career and turned to it again at the end of it to generate much needed income. So he lampooned and pilloried journalists who lampooned and pilloried him back, but he did so through the medium of journalism. And finally, going back to this question, these questions I've raised at the start of the paper, he claimed that acting was not an art and it was writing that was the true work of the artist. So in his essay, My Pupils, he wanted to expose the fatuity of the pretense that an actor is a kind of poet in action. And he argued that he isn't, it's the writer who is the poet, who is the artist in the work of the theatre. On the other hand, he claimed that playmaking is a trade like carpentering. Originality, speaking by the card, is a quality that never existed. So while on the one hand he argues that it's writing that is the true work of the artist in the theatre, on the other hand he also likened playwrights to tradespeople or artisans. And this claim that originality never exists in the theatre is one that, of course, again contradicts his claims around plagiarism protections, which he's constantly lobbying for. So he's very attached to originality when it comes to his own income, but also claims that it doesn't exist in the theatre. Now, when we accuse people of inconsistency or contradiction, we tend to either laugh, it makes us slightly uncomfortable, and often we imagine it as a kind of hypocrisy. What I want to suggest, though, is that this isn't necessarily only a case of Boucicault's roguishness, although that is doubtless in play here, but rather that Boucicault embodies the contradictions of his age, that these questions are continually in circulation and in conflict in the mid-19th century, and that what we're seeing in these kinds of contradictions or tensions is a battle for cultural authority among a number of figures in Victorian life. So the question is perhaps, who has cultural authority, the authority to speak and make claims in public? Is it the artist? And what do we mean by that? Is it the critic? Or is it the expert, who's a figure that I want to come to at the end of this paper? So rather than trying to come to any final answers on whether an actor is an artist, what I want to do is explore what it means to think about Boucicault as a highly skilled virtuosic performer, a virtuoso, and how these questions of originality, authenticity, and authority play out in the ways that we might understand his work as a highly skilled performer. So let's move to our next slide, because here I want to introduce us to the main focus of this paper, which is the Colleen Bawn, one of Boucicault's famous Irish melodramas, his first really famous Irish melodrama, which he wrote based on the novel by Gerard called The Collegians, which is about a real-life murder in Killarney. So we're already seeing the question of originality kind of playing out in slightly complex ways here. Boucicault first writes and performs this play in New York in Laura Keane's theatre, and then brings it to London, where it becomes a true cultural sensation. Now, I want to take you really quickly through what this play meant to its audiences, and then we're going to have a little reading, which is very exciting, and then I'm going to think about Boucicault as the star actor in this play. What I should say is that my summary of the kind of context for this show is really drawn from the work of Nick Daly, who is my collaborator on this Boucicault network and writes brilliantly about this show in his book on sensation and modernity in the 1860s. I think the first and really important thing to say about this show is that it's the first long run in British theatre history. It goes on for 230 performances over 10 months at the new Adelphi Theatre. And this is in the context in which previously performances tended to take place for maybe 4 or 5 nights in a row. So this tells us something about the astonishing power that this show had in the imagination of its audiences. And importantly, it creates a kind of serial theatre going in which audiences come back time and time again to witness the excitement on display. The play is concerned with the Irish peasant girl Emilie, innocent Irish peasant girl Emilie, who's played by Agnes Robertson, Boucicault's Scottish wife. And Emilie is secretly married to Hardress Cregan, an Anglo-Irish aristocrat whose mother wants him to make a better match. And in a series of misunderstandings, his evil henchman, Danny Mann, who is a hunchback, takes Emilie out onto a lake in a boat and tries to take the marriage certificate from her to destroy it so that there's no longer evidence of Hardress Cregan having been married. Now, meanwhile, excitingly, Miles Nagopaline, the stage Irish comic character, the hero of the hour, is hunting otters illegally in the cliffs and drinking illegal whiskey, which he makes himself. And he mistakes Danny for an otter and shoots him, and then spots Emilie, who he's in love with sentimentally, in the water, and takes a dive into the lake and rises up with her, having saved her. Now, it's Boucicault's, in the guise of Miles Nagopaline, it's Boucicault's header nightly into the lake and Agnes Robertson's drowning night after night after night that causes enormous excitement for the audience who come back night after night to see it. And this serial act of theatre going is one we can see in evidence in Queen Victoria's diaries, who went to see the show 3 times. She was famously a little bit in love with Dion Boucicault. And in fact, it was the last public show she ever saw. Albert died shortly after the final show that she saw, and she withdrew into formal mourning from then on. The show also set off fashions in red wool cloaks, which were the traditional dress of Irish peasant women, and middle-class London audience members would dress up as Irish peasants in these red cloaks to go to the theatre, creating traffic jams on the Strand with their colleen cabs or hansom cabs decorated like Irish peasant wagons, which punch notes with some disparagement. Now, I'd like to ask my collaborators for this evening to join me on screen. So I'm just going to get out of the screen sharing for a minute and ask my collaborators to join me. We're going to do a little reading so that you can get a sense of what this play was like. And I want to say thank you to my fellow virtuosi for undertaking this. So I'm going to play Danny. Nick, in his great moment of glory, will be playing Miles Nagopaline, and also I'd like to think Boucicault. Sarah will be playing Emilie, and Emilie is going to be playing the stage directions. Right, let's get stuck in.
Danny steps out onto rock.
Give me that paper in your breast.
Boat floats off slowly.
I can't. I've sworn never to part with it. You know I have.
Emilie, that paper stands between Hardress Cregan and his fortune. That paper is the ruin of him. Give it, I tell yous.
Take me to the priest. Let him lift the oath of me. Oh, Danny, I swore a blessed oath on my 2 knees. And would ye ask me to break that?
Danny seizes her hands.
Give it up and don't make me hurt you.
I swore by my mother's grave, Danny. Oh, Danny, dear, don't, Acushla, and I'll do anything. See now, what good would it be? Sure, while I live, I'm his wife.
Music changes.
Then you've lived too long. Take your marriage lines with you to the bottom of the lake.
He throws her from rock backwards into the water. With a cry, she reappears, clinging to rock.
No, save me, don't kill me, don't, Danny. I'll do anything, only let me live.
He wants you dead.
Pushes her off.
Oh, heaven help me, Danny, Dad.
She sinks. Danny looking down.
I've done it. She's gone.
Shot is fired. He falls, rolls from the rock into the water. Miles appears with gun on rock.
I hit one of them base that time. I could see well though it was so dark, but there was something moving on that stone.
Swings across.
Divil a sign of him. Stop.
Looks down.
What's this? It's a woman. There's something white there.
Figure rises near rock. He kneels down, tries to take the hand of the figure.
Ah, that dress. It's Emilie, my own darling Emilie.
Pulls off waistcoat, jumps off rock. Emilie rises, then Miles and Emilie rise up. He turns and seizes rock. Emilie across left arm. End of Act 2.
Brilliant. I know that everyone is applauding wherever they are. So thank you all so much. Nick, if you lean over to one side, we will actually see the scene behind you. Look at that. Superb. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to disappear you all now and share my screen again. So thank you all so much to my fellow virtuosi for doing that reading. Hopefully you get a sense of how very exciting the scene is. And I think importantly for London audiences, we also have a sense of urban audiences consuming the image of great excitement, but within a rural Irish setting. So there's something very importantly escapist about the action that we're seeing on stage. Now, what's really important here is that as well as Boucicault's writing, the critics become very interested in him at this point as an actor. And this is really a moment where, while he has acted in many shows before, he really begins to make his name as a virtuosic performer for this astonishing ongoing stage dive that he manages to do nightly. And we can see that Lloyd's congratulates him for the sort of authenticity of his Irishness. They say his looks and speech, his chivalry and generosity are eminently Irish. He is evidently a studious and discriminating actor, which is really interesting because, of course, Boucicault is Irish, but there's this sense that he has to study stage Irishness in order to reproduce it effectively on stage. Now, I want to turn also to an account of him in his obituary. So this is after he's died. But the fact that the spirit of the times argue that while Boucicault has been written about as a writer, they say he was almost equally wonderful and much more original as an actor. Now, this leads me into a little moment of sort of academic due diligence, where I want to think about that idea of originality as an actor in relation to virtuosity and understand how that emerged alongside the figure of the journalist. Because what is important here, I think, is that it's not simply that Boucicault drew audiences to the theatre nightly, it's that journalists testify to his status as a virtuoso. He requires witnesses to provide evidence of the fact of his skill. And this is what I think is so interesting about the dual emergence of virtuosic performance on the one hand and journalists on the other, who emerge at the same historical moment. So here we see an image of Paganini, who is perhaps one of the first famous virtuosi. He's a violinist who is rumored to be possessed by the devil because of his astonishing fingerwork on the violin. And this association of the virtuosi with the supernatural or also the mechanistic, I think is really key to understanding their cultural power. Now, interestingly, virtuosity as a category doesn't begin with performers. In the Renaissance, it's a term used to describe critics and scholars, early scientists, in fact, who are known for their cultivation of knowledge, for their collections of libraries and interesting scientific objects. It's only the 18th century where a special category of performer emerges called the virtuoso, who is known for their dazzling displays of technique. And this is what distinguishes them from other kinds of performers, is that they stand forth from the performance, draw our attention to them for their astonishing mastery of stage technique and their apparent transcendence of it, which makes them appear capable of superhuman feats, but also of superhuman feats of repetition, which is how they are likened in some cases to machines. And I think, again, think back to that astonishing 230 stage dives in a row. So interestingly, the critic actually sits inside the figure of the virtuoso, who retains the scientific qualities of awe and astonishment, which is what really characterizes early science, and applies them to the figure of the performer. Now, the minute this figure sort of emerges as an important cultural figure, first in music and then later in dance and acting, at the immediate moment that they arise, we begin to see debates and anxiety attached to them. And that's because there's a wider emergence of the figure called the artist. Now, as systems of patronage recede in the 18th and 19th centuries, we have a new commercial art market in which art is understood very differently, no longer declared brilliant and beautiful and valuable because of the power of the patron, the king or the pope, for example. But now the value of art is attached to the person who's produced it, the artist. And so in the 18th and 19th century, we begin to see these tensions between the idea of the artist and the craftsperson, of art and craft. Now, performers fit in this distinction very unclearly, and the virtuoso particularly causes problems because rather than simply executing the work of others, which we might see as the work of a craftsperson, they stand forth and demand our attention in their own right. And so we see philosophers and composers and other sorts of artists getting very worried by them. Hegel argues that the virtuoso musician must submit himself entirely to the character of the work, serve the work, in other words, which of course is the work of the composer. And then later in the 19th century, Wagner, who of course has a lot of stake as a composer himself, echoes Hegel in saying that the virtuoso must simply serve the work, but he also disparages the virtuoso for a kind of form of artifice or almost deceit. He says of the virtuoso, though he be no artist, he yet has art dexterities to hand. These he lets play. They do not warm but glitter, and at night it all looks very nice. So we see this kind of rejection of virtuosity as superficial, as showy, and as also a kind of artificiality which is not to be trusted. Now, as I say, the virtuoso appeared at the same moment as the journalist. They appear in the same historical moment. So we can see in this slide, and I'm assuming you can all read, so I'll leave you look at these notes yourself, there's an astonishing increase in the number of publications from the mid-18th century to Boucicault's moment in the mid-19th century. So there's an astonishing speed at which journalism proliferates. That's partly because of new technologies in printing. It's also, of course, because of the increase of literacy and because there's a shift in the model of funding publication from a subscription model, which again is associated with the court system, to the system of advertising, which allows newspapers and periodicals to be funded in a commercial way. So journalists proliferate in this period. And what I think is fascinating is if we go back to this idea that the virtuoso actually starts as a critic and then turns into a performer, we can actually see that there's huge similarities between the two figures. Most of all, in that both are really culturally suspicious figures. They're viewed as untrustworthy, unreliable with the truth, and figures to be concerned about. So we can see these similarities in the ways that both journalist and virtuoso produce what we might call evanescent work. Their work disappears. It doesn't produce an object. Newspapers wrap up fish and chips. The work of the performer disappears nightly, but they also emerge through a kind of serial accumulation. So the newspaper is never quite finished. It appears again the next day. And similarly, the virtuoso appears nightly. We also see accusations of a kind of parasitical relationship to art in both cases. And interestingly, the question of plagiarism and originality is also really important to both. Journalists, particularly art critics, from the beginning, make claims to cultural authority in part by declaring that they are the ones to determine whether an artwork is original or not. And they spawn what are become known as plagiarism hunters in the 19th century, who see it as their job to unearth and uncover deceitfulness and a lack of originality. Similarly, virtuosity is unclearly connected to originality in that it's centered on the reinvention of old models, this sense that we're getting a new version of inherited techniques. We know it when we see it, emerges because we're familiar with the technique, but we see it being reinvented by the virtuoso. We also see an emphasis on novelty in both cases. So of course, the news, what is new for the journalist, and the idea that the virtuoso themselves comprise a kind of sensation of novelty and offers new reimagination of stage technique. And finally, the question of speed is really important to both. So the speed of production in the news in comparison to, say, literary production. And then, of course, one of the ways that virtuosi are understood to be as such is the fact that they often display their technique in the form of speed. I would make reference here to Michael Flatley, for example, being renowned as having the fastest feet on earth. And we can again also think of that astonishing display of split-second timing and daring by Boucicault in that stage dive in the Colleen Bawn. So what we see is figures that are very much alike and actually also rely on each other for their cultural authority. So as Susan Bernstein argues, the virtuoso emerges as a counterpart to the journalist, displaying the same evanescence and instability of purpose. The virtuosi provides the cultural reporter with subject matter, while the virtuoso's success is a function of journalistic advertising and good press coverage. So again, the virtuoso needs the journalist to testify to their skills, to render that a public fact, while at the same time, the journalist needs the performer in order to be able to make claims to cultural authority by nominating them. And we often see this in reviews now, where certainly in the British press, where someone like Michael Billington will say he is the greatest Hamlet of his generation. There's a sense in which the critic nominates the actor as the great figure, as the virtuoso. And we see in this Robert Macfarlane quote a reference to these plagiarism hunters who actually, again, claim cultural authority by being able to say that they know the difference between the original and the fake. Right, let's go back to Boucicault now that I've done my academic due diligence, and we're going to spend the rest of the paper with him. Because one of the questions I have is whether this issue of the question of originality and virtuosity becomes particularly acute when we think of a performer who is renowned for playing Irish roles. And I should say that Boucicault was dogged with accusations of plagiarism throughout his career. That court case was was perhaps one of many lawsuits actually taken by him or others against him. But we have a wider case of plagiarism hunters setting upon him with almost every play that he brings out of his 153 plays, in which they claim that he has plagiarized. And in fact, the term to Boucicault, which uses the original spelling of his surname, becomes a synonym for plagiarizing. Now, let's look at this quote from the Daily Telegraph in 1853, when Boucicault has just opened a new theatre, which he is running and putting on shows in, which eventually bankrupts him. And think about the kind of plagiarism accusations here, because they fall in two parts. First of all, Mr. Boucicault, whose genius seems to consist in rather the disinterring of old dramas, rather than in the writing or adapting of new ones. So there we go. There's him being a plagiarist, according to the Telegraph. But they go on to say something else, which I think is really interesting. Presents it also as his first novelty on the boards of his improved theatre, which inasmuch as it lies in Lambeth, he as an Irishman, of course, calls the Theatre Royal Westminster. So here we have a sense of Boucicault as being unreliable with the truth, because he's a plagiarist, but also because he's an Irishman. He's exaggerating the quality of the address of his new theatre, which is in Lambeth, but he's claiming is in Westminster. And I think here points to a kind of further layer of concern with originality, authenticity, and virtuosity in the ways that Boucicault is thought about publicly, which is the problem of a highly skilled performer playing stage Irish. So let's think for a moment about what stage Irishness might comprise, first of all. It's a term that is used pejoratively now, of course, but in the Victorian period, it's actually a category of character. It's an archetype, and it sits alongside lots of other archetypes on the Victorian stage. Given that Boucicault wrote melodramas, which have very clear moral codes, where villains and heroes are hugely recognizable by virtue of, you know, if you've got a black moustache and a cape, you're probably a villain. We also see other sorts of archetypes surrounding that hero and villain moral code. We see stage Yorkshiremen. We, of course, infamously see the blackface minstrel, who in the States in this period is often played by Irish immigrants and contributes to the formation of racist hierarchies in the States. And we see the stage Irishman, who is also played by Irish performers by and large, and often written by Irish writers who are often the same people. People like Tyrone Power, Edmund Falconer, and of course, Boucicault. So the stage Irishman, importantly, is a rural character. He's a peasant. He often is in a world that is situated in the past for this Victorian audience. So the Colleen Bawn, for example, is set in the 18th century. So he's nostalgic in the sense that he's from a past world that is understood now to be lost. And he embodies a whole set of qualities that Victorian urban audiences saw as unmodern or pre-modern. He's drunken, he's violent, he's garrulous, he's sentimental, he's honourable but untrustworthy or unreliable. And really importantly, he's lazy or idle. Now, let's think a little bit about unpicking the layers of the problems of originality when we look at Boucicault playing the stage Irish role. First of all, we have the sense that's become prevalent or widespread by the 1860s that the stage Irish figure has come to shape the way British people see the Irish in real life. So Irish people themselves are framed often and expected to conform to the stage Irish stereotype in reality. But as Roy Foster points out, we also see, because of that, the necessary psychological and historical pressures on the Irish to be unrealistic. In other words, to perform the kind of fiction of stage Irishness back to the British in real life. But as Foster points out, there's a growing suspicion and unease with the idea that the Irish might be rather strategically employing that stereotype to their own end, to cover up their kind of canniness in business dealings or in litigation. So Irish people are actually employing stage Irish stereotypes strategically for their own benefit. So even while stereotypes do a certain kind of cultural work of fixing identities, often in deeply problematic, racially biased ways, there's also ways in which the Irish are kind of turning that on its head and performing what is being claimed to be authentic Irishness, but with strategic ends. And we actually see that playing out in Boucicault's own plays, in which the stage Irish clown isn't actually stupid, but deploys stupidity as a kind of strategic act. So we can see this in, that's a typo, that should be 1864. We should see this in Boucicault's Aaron Pogue in 1864, ignore my typo, in which there's a famous courtroom scene, and Sean the Post, played again by Boucicault, is addressed by Ara, his love, played again by Agnes Robertson, who says, "Don't confess, Sean. Sean aside, never fear. I'm not such a fool as they think." The major who's holding the court case, "Are you guilty or not guilty? Sean, how would I know till I hear the evidence?" So what we see here is a kind of deployment of Irishness as a mask for the character's own ends, which allows Sean run rings around the English characters in this scene. And I think that really contributes to a sense that, as Sozeltis argues, Irishness itself is seen as a kind of plagiarized identity with no authentic origin, but rather than one that is almost dandy-like in its endless self-invention, in which there is no ultimate origin. And so for Boucicault to play the role is to amplify perhaps the anxieties about origin, originality, and authenticity. Furthermore, if we take account of the fact that the stage Irishman is idle or lazy or does no productive work, we start to see something very complicated emerging in the fact that Boucicault plays him. So interestingly, when Colleen Bawn opens in 1860 in New York, Boucicault makes a public speech in which he emphasizes his hard work. So he says, and the New York Tribune quotes him, "I think that it will be admitted by all of you that Irish men do most of the hard work in this country. I mean, real hard manual labor. I myself have worked very hard on the play for the past 7 months." Now, Deirdre McFeely reads this speech as part of Boucicault's lobbying for the rights of Irish immigrants in the States, as part of a somewhat complex and ambivalent advocacy for the country of his birth throughout his career. But I'm interested in the fact that he draws attention to himself and makes himself equivalent to doing real hard manual labor, which of course chimes with that claim earlier about playwriting being like the act of a carpenter. If we take account of this sense of him framing himself as a hard worker, what do we do with the fact that he's playing a lazy character? And I think it's important to point out that the Victorians are particularly anxious or concerned with this question of idleness, because idleness is seen as the pre-modern opposition to good, industrious, productive, bourgeois hard work in the mid-19th century. And if we think of work in urban spaces, or particularly in factories, we see a delineation between work time and play time or leisure time, which are very clearly and strictly demarcated. Idleness, on the other hand, is seen, as Anson Rabenbach argues, is a vestige of a less industrious age and from a less measured mode of life. It was seen as the most pernicious sign of habits that anachronistically and stubbornly refused to loosen their hold on behavior. Idleness was identified with corruption, vice, villainy, and venality. Now, of course, there are particular identities and communities that are accused of idleness, and the Irish are one of those communities in Britain at the time. And so thinking about the stage Irish character then for Victorian audiences, I think it's really important that these plays are often set in times earlier than the audience, because it allows this urban audience feel nostalgic for a moment in which work and play weren't so clearly separated, to have a kind of moment of escape from the demands of modern life, of being a modern, while at the same time being able to close that world off once the curtain came down. So we can see, for example, in Edmund Falconer's play, Eileen Og, and I should say Edmund Falconer was an actor who worked a lot with Boucicault, but also wrote his own stage Irish plays. We can see a scene in which it's set in a hayfield, in which agricultural workers brandish shillelaghs and sing and dance. And they sing, "Oh, isn't it fun to make love in the hay? It's best to combine your work and your play." And importantly, this dance scene is curtailed by the arrival of the British Army, which happens almost always in scenes of Irish dance in stage Irish plays. We see it in Aaron of Hogue, which the army turn up to. We see it in Pike O'Callaghan when the police turn up. There's a sense in which we get Irish peasant disorderliness and idleness, even though that idleness involves actually really hard agricultural work, which is curtailed or organized or put into order by the arrival of literal law and order onto the stage. So what does it mean then to think of Boucicault playing an unskilled, idle character with consummate virtuosity? I think it's important to say that the newspapers notice how much work is involved. Bailey's monthly notices the exertion of all of those participating. The Times notes Agnes Robertson's fatigue at the end of the show after a short afterpiece in which she dances an Irish jig in male costume. There's a recognition of the exhaustion of these performers in the demands that the performance makes of them and the kind of discipline required of them, although Agnes Robertson then bemoans the effects of the long run on actorly technique and discipline later in her life. So what we see is not only a character who is unclearly ever original or reliable or authentic, being played by a public persona who contradicts the very characteristics that he performs. And this, I think, is a really important feature of the ongoing cultural suspicion that attaches itself to Boucicault. It's not only the fact that he is a skillful performer playing an unskillful character, it's that he also wrote the play and often produced it, that he provides a composite figure which doesn't allow us separate out these functions of writer versus performer versus businessman. And this, it seems to me, is one of the reasons that he is accused on an ongoing basis of theft, because he steals from himself. And we can see this, certainly Punch notices this when they say that they look on a play with additional interest when the author is included in the role. So they are quite approving of the fact that they're seeing him play his own words. But we also see in the Saturday programme, in relation to the chaperone, the accusation that Mr. Boucicault has taken due care to give himself the pick of the wit and the best situations in the drama. In other words, he guarantees his own virtuosity by the fact that he writes his own plays. And there's a sense, again, in which Boucicault is not to be trusted because he forms this composite figure. Now, I want to suggest that one of the reasons this might start to become a problem is because of the emerging figure of the professional and the expert in the 19th century. This idea that people should specialize in one particular area and be known only for it, which is a claim that the older professions make earlier in the century, so the law and medicine and so on, but which is a claim that newer professions like journalism begin to make in this period. And so the sense of the composite actor manager, which also includes, of course, the figure of the theatre director, causes problems in a sense for this desire to know who is the artist, to know who is the servant to the artist or the craftsperson, to know who is the expert rather than the executor of expertise. Boucicault, however, carried on as this composite figure for the rest of his career, and perhaps it's not a surprise then that at the end of his career, he ends up unearthing that earlier sense of virtuoso by turning to journalism and producing numerous articles for the North American Review. And even here, I think we can see this increasing emphasis on expertise in the fact that the contributors are now named. You may have noticed that many of the reviews that I've cited in this paper did not come with the name of a journalist. And that wasn't just me being bad at referencing. It was actually the fact that in earlier times, journalists weren't specialized. They covered a range of topics and were rarely named within reviews and articles. The North American Review is the manifestation of a later form of journalism in which we begin to see the idea that people should be expert in what they write about, and in which artists themselves become important reviewers of artwork. So Oscar Wilde, for example, is another famous Irish figure who becomes known for his journalism and his commentary on artwork. So I want to finish with a quote that is very famous from Boucicault, which is this. It's a brilliant quote. "I can spin out these rough and tumble dramas as a hen lays eggs. It's a degrading occupation, but more money has been made out of guano than out of poetry." It's important to say that guano is bird shit, and it was sold as fertilizer in the 19th century. So bird shit is something that became a commodity and a useful form of recycling. And this, I think, speaks to what Robert Macfarlane argues, which is that while we see the plagiarism hunters at work in the 19th century, and certainly accusing Boucicault as such, we also see another model of artwork emerging, which frames itself around the act of recycling. And this actually is a concern with shit, as Macfarlane argues. The concern was what to do with dust, which is another sort of euphemism, and whether human effluents, which is of course causing miasma in cities, could be used to fertilize crops, whether there's a sort of circulation of waste product and growth. And he argues, while human effluents might be used to fertilize healthy crops, so could literary effluence, the verbal outpourings of others, valuably and productively become literary influence. So what he describes as the benevolent round of decomposing and recomposing in relation to literary work might very well be used to describe most of the work that happens in the theatre, not only the work of the playwright, but also, of course, the work of the virtuoso, and indeed of the journalist, and even perhaps the plagiarist. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can all talk to each other.
Aoife, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. And I am dying to discuss some of these issues with you and also to hear other people's questions. But we are going first to Sara Keating, who is going to respond to your paper. And let me just introduce Sara properly for anybody who doesn't know her. Sara Keating is a writer and cultural journalist. She has been writing about theatre for the Irish Times and Business Post since 2006 and has contributed to a wide variety of programming on RTE Radio 1. She has a PhD in theatre from Trinity College Dublin. And Sara, I'm going to hand over to you now to talk to Aoife. One note before Sara starts talking, just if anybody has any questions that have been brewing through Aoife's talk or that come to mind during Sara's response, please do either prepare them or put them in the chat. And that means that we will have some questions to turn to in about 10 or 15 minutes. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Emilie. And thank you, Aoife, for a really stimulating chat. I suppose my response is really kind of going to be formed as a series of questions to you. And at the start, when we were kind of preparing for the session, and at the start of your talk today, you posed your own questions, which you then went on to say that you weren't going to be able to answer definitively. And I thought that these would be my first responses to your paper. But they're not. I'm going to kind of be really specific, I suppose, in the first thing I'd like to talk with you about. And that really is how much the anxiety of new technologies seem to be prevalent in shaping this dichotomy that emerges at the end of the 18th century, and even within Boucicault himself as he decides to draw a line between his two different professions. So I suppose what struck me, thinking about how he seemed to privilege his writing above his acting, whether there was any sense with kind of mass printing presses, with the emergence of journalism, whether he felt that, you know, as an actor, he could age out of roles. However, as somebody who has published a script, that script will be there and last forever, whereas with his acting roles, all he would ever have, if it lasted beyond fish and chip papers, was a couple of lines in a newspaper. And I'm wondering, could you respond a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's really fascinating. And I love this idea that technology is one of the features of the sorts of anxiety that's circulating, because that's absolutely right. I think printing presses are really important here. And also, of course, the technologies of the stage, which Boucicault is famous for using and inventing. I mean, he's an incredible inventor, which contribute to the idea of technique in relation to technology. So we get sort of numerous forms of special effects. We get special effects in new kinds of lighting and stage machinery, and we get special effects in what the performer seems capable of carrying off. So the two are really, really interconnected, I think. I would say, now, far be it for me to read the mind of Boucicault, but I would say that I would be surprised in some way if there was ever an expectation that his work be considered literature that would last. And he himself constantly had this sort of ambivalent, slightly arch way of framing what he did as a writer. So that final quote about, you know, being like a hen that lays eggs, the astonishing proliferation of his work, the fact that he wrote 153 plays, although of course it was claimed that he stole a lot of them, or they were versions of French plays, for example. There is a sense in which consumer culture is really massively manifesting in the moment that he's writing. And actually you're seeing a circulation of objects, which play scripts are only really one of one kind, and which aren't necessarily considered to last beyond their moment. In fact, earlier today, just to do our little flagging up of our other events, we've had a kind of closed workshop with theatre historians about souvenirs. And actually, there's huge numbers of souvenirs that emerge out of Boucicault's work. People buy stuff. They buy sheet music. They buy amateur versions of his plays to perform at home. They buy sort of figurines that represent scenes from the plays. And the play texts are almost, I suspect, culturally at that moment, considered equivalent. So I'm not sure he saw his legacy being protected by being a writer necessarily, because writing is disposable, a bit like newspaper at that point. But Nick might want to come in later and contradict me on that. I think Boucicault kind of longed for a literary legacy, but I don't know if he thought he'd have it.
Well, I suppose because at this time there was, the kind of beginnings of the emergence of the art theatre as well, which again, I think about this kind of anxiety, this dichotomy between the literary arts and the more popular art forms. I suppose just as you, and I'm going to kind of move the discussion on in a little bit, but towards a kind of a more contemporary discourse in a moment, but I suppose just as you're talking there, so let's say if Boucicault is not necessarily thinking it's because, this work will last and this work doesn't, to what degree do you think that, apart from his performance as an actor, as you really described in great detail, and it was amazing to read the quotes or to hear the quotes from the newspapers of the time, but to what degree his performance, I suppose, as the persona of Boucicault, and basically to, let's say, set up this dichotomy between acting and writing, and to kind of dismiss the actor as the craft person, whether that was just a way of generating good copy.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I started with the contradictions is right, because he never really pursues a singular line in his views on things. And like you say, I think it is actually that he had great flair as a journalist. He knew how to turn a phrase, both as a performer and as a writer. He was also a provocateur. And very much saw himself, I think, at the heart of kind of these big cultural debates. So he chimes in with debates through newspaper letters to newspapers as well as articles. So yes, like I say, there's a kind of ambivalent line being treaded there, because he might say on one hand, playwriting is like carpentry, but then he also claims that the writer is the soul of the theatre. So, he doesn't tend to stick to a single coherent line. And the provocateur role, I mean, interesting, he meets T.P. Barnum early in his career in Paris, and Barnum, of course, coins the term, what is the term? There's no such thing as bad publicity. So Barnum is an early case of self-promotion, self-marketing as a key means to manage the business of show business. And Boucicault is a kind of acolyte for that. So this work of journalism is also absolutely not only about producing good copy, but about keeping himself inside the cultural conversation, which does him good service as an entrepreneur. And his energy and spirit is entrepreneurial. It's about managing his work within a particular commercial market and using all of these different venues to do that. So being consistent doesn't really matter as long as he's producing the interest.
Because one of the, I suppose, more contemporary figures that kept on coming to mind as you were talking today, in terms of kind of this idea of strategically employing Irishness, opening up debates about authenticity, the idea of identity as something that's plagiarized, dandy-like in endless self-inventions. These are just some of the terms you were using. Was the figure of Martin McDonagh, who emerged again in 1996 at the same time that the internet is emerging and the same time as mass media changing in the context of journalism into the online space where everybody's opinion becomes valid. And I suppose I know when we were being introduced at the start, just prior to the session, we were having a little chat on video, and Aoife, you mentioned that, you know, in Boucicault's day, people thinking, you know, and until quite recently, this idea of Boucicault as an academic figure, you know, and somebody whose work was worth taking seriously. Again, with Martin McDonagh in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, this is very much the way in which discourse around him developed. So I'm wondering where you see these, you know, do you see these issues as having, I suppose, maybe what differences we can see between the figure of Boucicault or the discourse of authenticity and Irishness in the more globalized context?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so pleased, Sarah, that you bring up the 1990s, because actually the reason that I'm interested in Boucicault is because of the 1990s. So I'm working on a book which I seem to have endlessly been working on. I don't produce as much material as Boucicault did, I should say, which is thinking about the role of virtuosity in the ways that the 1990s, and particularly the Celtic Tiger moment, thought about itself. And McDonagh is fascinating, and I would put him alongside Michael Flatley. I would put him alongside Father Ted and latterly Mrs. Brown's Boys. And the reason for that is that one of the things that began to fascinate me about the Celtic Tiger is the ways in which the 19th century becomes a place of reconsideration, I think, in the 90s. I want to just go on a slight tangent for a minute, because I'm always very tickled by this as a story that becomes a kind of metaphor maybe for the 90s, which is famously the Queen Victoria statue on the grounds of University College Cork, which in the 1950s was taken down and buried in the grounds because it was seen as no longer acceptable as a kind of icon of an empire. And then in the 1990s, because of the work of an historian within the university, it was disinterred. But it was done at night because there was concerns that the IRA might attack it. And so there's astonishing footage of nighttime of this statue sort of appearing from the earth. And the statue now sits inside the museum in UCC. And I've been thinking about that story a lot. Obviously, the question of statues and iconography at the moment is really powerful, but Ireland's been kind of doing that for quite a long time. And the fact that this 19th century statue commemorating Victoria's visit to Cork reappears in the 90s, having been buried, feels like a brilliant metaphor for what happens in the theatre, where the 19th century, I think, gets rediscovered. Because, of course, the revivalists announce explicitly Boucicault is no longer viable for us. You know, we are ridding the theatre of the buffoonery and easy sentiment of the stage Irishman. And of course, I think he probably lingers on in lots of ghostly ways. But the 90s becomes a moment where he gets reclaimed. The Chaperon gets performed in the Abbey. It's directed by John McColgan, who was the producer of Riverdance. There's ways in which there's an alignment, even in Riverdance, of displays of 19th century urban spectacle. You know, the play is, Riverdance is half set in New York, and we see these immigrants performing, you know, their ethnic displays, very much repeating that kind of 19th century urban display. Just to end, I know I'm traveling to lots of places here. I'm interested by the fact that McDonagh is a member of the diaspora, as is Michael Flatley. And there's something really fascinating about a kind of reverse in which Boucicault, born in Dublin, makes his career elsewhere and brings Ireland to the rest of the world. What we see in Flatley and in McDonagh is the diaspora bringing Irishness back to Ireland and offering it back within a kind of diasporic form. I think that's really fascinating.
And it's so interesting that you mentioned the production of the Chaperon at the Abbey in 2004, which of course was its centenary year. And obviously, I'm sure you've probably in your academic work had great fun with the fact that it's kind of critical disaster, it's transferred to the West End. John McColgan, again, is another kind of virtuoso or impresario you know, it bankrupts the theatre. The reviews are shocking. I was looking up some of them last night in preparation, and even the discourse in which they were, even the discourse and the language that was being used being so really striking me in relation to the language that's being used to talk about Boucicault, you know, folk Irishry at its worst, with picturesque peasants in bright, beautifully laundered costumes breaking into jigs, this sense of, you know, it being Disneyland. And again, that, you know, that kind of contrast between the way in which Boucicault was seen to be so authentic, but now these reproductions of Boucicault 100 years later are seen to be, you know, inauthentic. So that's a kind of a really interesting kind of contrast there. But I did think actually one fact that struck me when I was looking at the production history of Boucicault at the Abbey, obviously this kind of idea of the National Theatre, you know, where Boucicault is placed within that, and to see that the first Boucicault was actually produced in 1905 at the Abbey. So that was Grimaldi, and you're thinking, oh wow, Kathleen de Houlihan and Boucicault. But then he doesn't appear again until 1967, and the Abbey just reopening after the fire. And if you think of, you know, wondering to what degree it was trying to bring the popular audience with it from the Queen's back, you know, kind of into the Abbey. But then obviously you know, it's the 90s and the late 1990s, 1996, 97, 98, and then 2004, where you have this kind of renewed interest. And I would say as well, you know, I would wonder to what degree it was kind of spearheaded by the success of MacDonagh, where, you know, he was seen in his form and the kind of stage Irishry of the characters as the inheritor of Boucicault, you know, and whether that was directly influential on the interest among contemporary directors to place him on the stage again.
Yeah, I mean, I would probably counter your MacDonagh with my Michael Flatley there, actually, because the crucial thing with the McColgan production of the Chocron is that it featured a river dance scene.
Yeah.
And there actually isn't one in the play. I mean, so Boucicault actually did include Irish dance scenes in lots of his plays, but the Chocron, apart from Con dancing and singing, there isn't one. So we get an imposition of river dance, and that becomes the way that Boucicault gets kind of grounded in the 90s. It's also true that there's terrible critical response to it, but it's a huge box office hit in Ireland. It's not in the West End, so interestingly, it doesn't travel, but the Abbey do really well out of it initially, although their contract with McColgan becomes a site of huge controversy, not least because he was on the board of the theatre.
Yeah, can I sorry, just to interrupt you there, because it's one thing that what I really found very interesting, particularly in relation to what you were talking about, this idea of plagiarism and originality. And first off, I suppose how similar these contemporary productions all looked. They all went for the same kind of painted backdrops, painted sceneries. Let's bring our modern technology, but ultimately we're going to do it in the Victorian style. But the second thing, specifically in relation to McColgan's production, was the fact that, you know, I was thinking, I was looking up stage imagery, and I was thinking, oh, you know, maybe I should put a few photos that we could screen share so people could see if we got discussing about this. And actually the copyright protection on those images, you know, usually if you Google up, you know, you will find some image somewhere, but even in all the newspaper reviews, the images are blurred out or removed entirely. And I thought that was so interesting, because again, if we think about this anxiety about plagiarism or cultural authority, who has the authority to discuss this production that ended in disaster, it's like a whitewash, even in the digital internet age.
Fascinating. Yeah, and actually, what I would say there is that there is some really interesting equivalence again between McColgan and Boucicault, because when Riverdance succeeds as it does, the coverage of it and of Flatley's later shows, you find actually more often in the business pages than you do in the arts pages. So you get some reviews, but actually they are written much more about in terms of the innovations of these figures as entrepreneurs, and then in their financial success and their role as employers. And I think there is something fascinating about the critical anxiety that happens when the critic gets displaced. And I say this as a critic too, as an academic, where you end up with work where the value of the work is being shaped around box office receipts, about records broken, about the numbers of places that a show is toured to. And the show doesn't need critics to validate it. It doesn't need witnesses, because the witness is the market. And I think that does something really interesting. It feels very different to write about work that doesn't need you, against writing about work that is very much almost open to a critical conversation that requires a critic as a witness. So this sort of idea that, you know, it's a critical failure but a box office success is really fascinating, I think, because that provokes critical anxiety.
Yeah,
Makes it harder to write about.
and I think as well, just, you know, I know when you were talking about, you know, the idea, the emergence of the critic as expert and the journalist as cultural authority, and again, how in this contemporary moment that has really shifted. Again, you know, so do we need a critic at all when we have somebody on Twitter giving it 4 or 5 stars? That said, I do think that once again, we've kind of shifted and there is more value of expertise. But even, you know, sometimes, you know, even from my own position, I don't regard myself as an authority. I regard myself as somebody who's extremely well informed, somebody who has, you know, a specialist interest and has done all their work. But I would not, you know, I would never even, I know you quoted Michael Billington and saying that somebody said that, you know, such and such a person is the greatest performer on the stage. I feel like I could not actually, you know, even if I saw 365 shows in a year, I still would feel like I would need to count that in my opinion.
Yeah.
And again, because of that shift that we've had where all opinions are now available.
You know, with this discussion about the audience, this might be the perfect time to bring in the audience, right? And to think about dispersing our idea of expertise. So I'm going to actually invite some more questions, either in the Q&A or in the chat. And also I'm going to invite Professor Nicholas Daly to join us at this point. I was struck when Aoife, you were talking about originators. And of course, as you mentioned, Nick Daly is the originator of tonight's event and the co-organizer of the network. And so it's and of course also a brilliant dramatic actor, as we heard earlier. There's actually a question that's come in already, and it strikes me that it links some of the discussion of the kind of 19th century virtuoso and the late 20th century, which is there a religious distinction between idleness and virtue? And to think about how that would resonate very differently, obviously, at the end of the 20th century, for so many of the reasons, Sarah, you were bringing up there in terms of the different kind of attitudes towards expertise and so on. So do people want to respond to that question?
Nick, do you want to have a go at that? I'm happy to.
I'm not sure that I have any very sharp answer to that. Certainly, I think as Aoife was saying, that's one of the things that made the Irish peasant both sort of attractive and maybe slightly kind of dubious for urban British audiences, that they were these kind of, on the one hand, figures out of some kind of notional organic community, a sort of land of milk and honey, but at the same time they were kind of pre-industrial in a bad way, much given to priestcraft and whiskey, and the dancing was both engaging and maybe a sign that they were spending too much time dancing. And you know, it does, even though it's a slightly different thing, it does sort of chime with the way in which blackface minstrel shows worked, where again audiences in the industrial north were both sort of enchanted and appalled by the kind of the representation of these kind of happy-go-lucky singing, dancing plantation field hands. Obviously, you know, at marked variance with the actual experience of chattel slavery, but that wasn't something that they were greatly troubled by. I think they were both sort of fascinated and a little bit sort of, you know, worried by these sort of combinations of idleness and, well, happiness. Very, very non-Victorian work ethic, I suppose, all of us.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the religious question is an interesting one, because the language of modernity, at least in Victorian London, I think borrows Christian rhetoric and it is being preached from the pulpit. I mean, we see this very much, but it's being borrowed to speak to what it means to live in an industrial age and how you're supposed to behave within that industrial age. So Christianity is kind of combining in with other sorts of rhetoric around what it means to be a good worker and what it means to be a good modern, what it means to be modern.
And I suppose just to kind of bring in the postmodern context to it again, I mean, I would argue that in McDonagh's work, the sheer idleness is, speaks, is perhaps one of the reasons why the characters are all so vile and why there are so many horrific crimes. It's the murder capital because, apart from a grave digger, we don't have people who have employment. They just hang around their cottages all day. But also how religious iconography kind of functions in an ironic way in that context, with our crucifixes and our, the pictures of the religious pictures that hang in the backdrop. So it's obviously a completely different kind of context, but something I think that does figure on the interpretive level in that context as well.
Can I ask Aoife about something slightly different? Since you mentioned it early on, I was thinking about that sort of connection between virtuosity on the one hand and the question of legacy that Sarah mentioned. And I was trying to think, how does that work out in terms of second generation celebrities? So, Boucicault has 3 children who go on the stage. There's Dion Jr., pretty successful, Aubrey, quite successful as a sort of a matinee idol, and Nina, who's the first Peter Pan in the West End production. So they're all very successful figures, and but they get some of their celebrity magic, I guess, from that name, from the fact that they're Boucicaults, and not unlike other acting dynasties like the Barrymores, or Irish acting dynasties, you could say, like the Barrymores and the Tyrone Powers. So how does that work? Do you think that sort of second generation celebrity is sort of a derivative in some ways celebrity, but also, of course, obviously you don't become a star simply on the basis of name. There's a lot of, it isn't just kind of social capital that you inherit. That you actually have to also do all the training, and how does that work, do you think? That's a slightly random thought, but I think maybe quite interesting for Boucicault.
It is, yeah, and I am really interested by dynasties in the theatre. So I suppose there's 2 ways of going there. One is this idea that the virtuoso gets framed as a craftsperson in part because what they do is navigate inherited technique, and that's how the artisan is understood to work. Which is why they get denied the status of artist. They're not seen as original creators. The children, in a way, do that doubly because they inherit the celebrity and the technique, and presumably their command of that, but their ability to shift it by a generation. Because what I think is always saddening reading Boucicault's later journalism is the fact that the through line is really things aren't as good as they used to be, and everybody's gotten it wrong, but I had it right. So there's that real sort of grief actually that runs through. And I am fascinated by what happens to virtuoses when they're no longer virtuosic, what happens to them as figures. And so there is something fascinating, but that the children not only inherit the celebrity, but they presumably inherit technique, which can then be reworked so that it can be seemingly of its moment. But actually also this question of dynasty speaks to this issue of the professional, because one of the problems in the theatre is that actually the mid-19th century onwards is the moment where actors start to try and claim to be professionals, and they set up all kinds of organizations, including churches actually, but also unions and so on, to try and render their work respectable. But their professional, the idea of a kind of professional rise is very hard to map. Your hierarchy is very clear. And so where they do set up training as a form of gatekeeping, once you're trained, how do you know you've progressed? So what you get is these claims to inheritance an ancestry that become a way for actors to lay claim to kind of status and authenticity. So dynasties are really important for that, that you kind of belong and you have a place in the hierarchy because you've inherited it. And I think it's almost pseudo aristocratic. You know, you inherit the mantle, and that is a problem if you want to seem professional, because professions are really not aristocratic. They're offering a different model of progress. So yeah, I think dynasties are interesting because they cause a bit of a problem for actors when they try to be claimed to be professionals.
So I guess it is quite like this sort of predicament of modern royal families who are both sort of, you know, Hello Magazine celebrities and claim to be something beyond celebrity, to have some sort of special bloodline thing that's sort of, you know, feudal rather than a part of the market.
Yeah, and they often inherit objects that they use on stage. So there's a sense of being bestowed with the family furniture that goes around with them on stage. You know, they have swords and costumes and all sorts of things which they carry on using.
Although that's so interesting, I know in the Endgame currently running at the Gate, Frankie Boyle making his stage debut is Ham, and the hat that they used to construct the hat that he wears, it was actually the hat that, and it's gone completely out of my head, famous American interpreter of Beckett, clown.
Buster Keaton?
Mr. Keaton.
No, contemporary. If I can go onto my computer, I just actually can't think of his name. Anyway, he played Ham in like 2004. And he gave the director his hat, who is a friend of his, and she consults with him on all Beckett stuff. And she gave him the hat, and they actually used the hat to construct the hat for Frankie Boyle as that idea of the object that's symbolic, that would, you know, carry his spirit into this debut performance of a comedian taking on this really serious role. And I love the fact that you don't know that unless you know it. You know, you don't know it unless, well, I did an interview with them and they told me it, and I put it in the newspaper. But you know. If you didn't read that, that's not knowledge, and that's just something that they carry within themselves as a way of getting authenticity for their performance.
This has all been fascinating. I see a question actually in the chat about people asking in relation to tomorrow's events, because clearly there's an appetite for more. And just to say that, yes, the links are there to register, and you can register. I mean, I'm asking Aoife and Nick really, but yeah. People can just register for them, and they start at kind of 10:30 tomorrow morning, I think.
10 o'clock, I think.
10 o'clock, still not too early start
exactly.
for staging Irishness. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this topic and who wants to continue some of these conversations to make the most of this extraordinary combination of
all free and just available through Eventbrite.
Exactly. It falls to me now just to thank our panelists today. I want to thank Sara Keating for her response, and thank Nick Daly for his questions and part of discussion, and also for dreaming up this event in the first place. And I particularly want to thank Aoife for her virtuosic performance in relation to Dion Boucicault, and to thank everybody for being here and being part of this virtual Boucicault event. So on behalf of the organisers and of the Royal Irish Academy, I'm just going to bring this to a close and say thank you and good night.
Thank you, Emilie.
Thank you. I'm just going to say Bill Irwin. That was the actor. Thank you so much.
Bill Irwin.
Thank you all so much. Thank you. That was a really nice evening. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye everybody. Bye.